The conference room smelled like expensive leather and old mahograms, the kind of scent that clings to places where fortunes change hands and families fall apart. I sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, watching my father's lawyer shuffle through documents with trembling fingers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting cold shadows across everyone's faces. My brother Marcus sat directly across from me, his designer suit immaculate, his expression smug. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our father's eyes. And me? I was the ghost at the table, the daughter who had somehow become invisible over the years, erased from family photos, excluded from holiday gatherings, written out of the narrative of our family's success. My father had died 3 weeks ago, and this was the first time I'd been invited to anything family-related in nearly a decade. I should have known it wasn't an invitation, it was a finale. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and began reading. My father's assets were substantial: real estate holdings, investment portfolios, the family business worth millions. As Henderson read each line, every single asset went to Marcus. The beach house in Malibu, the downtown property portfolio, the controlling shares of the company. Everything. When Henderson finally looked up at me, his face was carefully neutral. And to my daughter, he paused, glancing at my father's signature at the bottom of the page. Nothing is bequeathed. The word hung in the air like smoke. Nothing. Marcus leaned back in his chair, barely suppressing a smile. He had won, just as he'd always won. Just as our father had always ensured he would win. But then I did something that made Henderson's pen freeze midair. I smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter one. A knowing smile. I leaned forward, folded my hands on the table, and said in a voice so calm it could have frozen hell itself, "He hasn't seen it yet, has he? Comment I'm still here if you want to know what happens next, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming." Henderson's face went pale. Marcus's smirk faltered. And in that moment, I knew that everything my father had tried to bury was about to surface. But to understand what happened in that conference room, you need to understand how I got there. You need to know the story of how a father systematically erased his daughter from existence, and how that daughter spent years preparing for this exact moment. This story didn't start at the will reading. It started 37 years earlier, in a house where love was conditional and perfection was the only acceptable currency. I was born in late autumn, during a thunderstorm that knocked out power across 3 counties. My mother used to say I came into the world fighting, that even as an infant I had a fire in me that couldn't be extinguished. But somewhere along the way, my father decided that fire needed to be put out. He never said it directly, men like my father never do. Instead, it was the small things. The way he'd forget to pick me up from school, but never miss Marcus's baseball games. The way my accomplishments were met with a nod while Marcus's were celebrated with elaborate dinners. The way family photos gradually featured fewer and fewer shots of me until eventually, I wasn't in them at all. By the time I was 13, I understood the truth. I was not the child my father wanted. I didn't know why. I just knew it was true. Marcus, on the other hand, could do no wrong. He was charismatic, athletic, exactly the kind of son a successful businessman wanted to mold in his image. My father poured resources into him. The best schools, the right connections, opportunities that opened doors before Marcus even knew they existed. And Marcus absorbed it all, growing more entitled with each passing year, more convinced that the world owed him everything simply because he existed. I tried in the beginning. I brought home perfect report cards. I won academic competitions. I volunteered. I did everything I could think of to earn my father's approval. But the harder I tried, the more invisible I became. It was as if my very existence offended him in some way I couldn't understand. Drop a justice in the comments if you think children should be treated equally. This gets darker. When I was 16, something changed. I came home from school one day to find my mother crying in the kitchen, holding a stack of papers. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, just pulled me into a fierce hug and whispered, "Don't let him erase you." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. But 3 months later, my mother filed for divorce. The battle was vicious and public. My father used every resource at his disposal to paint her as unstable, unfit. He had lawyers, private investigators, connections in every corner of the legal system. My mother had righteousness and not much else. She fought anyway. The custody arrangement gave my father primary custody of Marcus and my mother custody of me. It should have been a relief. I'd be away from the cold indifference of my father's house. But instead, something worse happened. My father began systematically removing evidence of my existence. It started with the small things. Family photos were replaced with versions that had been edited. I was simply cropped out or photoshopped away. His social media, carefully curated for business purposes, showed only Marcus. When people asked about me, he'd give vague answers or change the subject. Then it escalated. Credit cards in my name that he'd opened for building credit were closed. The college fund my grandparents had set up for me mysteriously vanished, transferred into accounts I couldn't access. Documents disappeared. Even my birth certificate went missing from the family files. My mother fought it, but she was outmatched. My father was wealthy, connected, and relentless. By the time I turned 18, I had been effectively erased from the official family narrative. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, my father didn't attend. When I got into Stanford on a full academic scholarship, he sent no congratulations. When I graduated summa cum laude 4 years later, I didn't even bother inviting him. He had made his choice clear. In his world, I simply didn't exist. Comment, keep going if you're invested. The betrayal goes even deeper than you think. But here's what my father didn't know. I was watching him. During college, I studied business and law, and I started investigating. I wanted to understand why. What had I done to deserve this erasure? Was it something about me, or was there something deeper, something he was trying to hide? I hired a private investigator with money I'd saved from scholarships and part-time jobs. What we uncovered changed everything. My father's business empire, the one he'd built his entire identity around, wasn't as clean as it appeared. There were deals made in shadows, contracts signed with people whose names appeared in federal investigations. Money moved through channels that didn't quite add up. Nothing overtly illegal, my father was too smart for that, but ethically murky, the kind of business practices that could destroy a reputation if they came to light. And I had been there for some of it. As a child, I'd been in his home office when certain meetings happened. I'd overheard conversations. I'd seen documents that, years later, I realized were significant. My father hadn't erased me because I didn't matter. He'd erased me because I was a liability. I was the witness to parts of his life he wanted buried. By removing me from the family narrative, he was protecting himself from the one person who could connect dots he desperately needed to keep separated. Armed with this knowledge, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't expose him. Instead, I would wait. I would build my own life, my own success, and I would be ready for the day when his carefully constructed walls came down. That day came sooner than I expected. My father's health began declining when he was 67. Heart problems, the doctor said. Stress and genetics catching up with decades of ruthless ambition. He had surgery, recovered partially, then had a second scare. That's when he started putting his affairs in order. That's when the lawyers got involved. Type plot twist, if you think you know where this is going, I promise you don't. What my father didn't know was that I had maintained a relationship with his primary lawyer's assistant. We'd gone to college together, and she'd ended up working at the firm that handled all of my father's legal affairs. She couldn't give me direct information. That would be unethical and illegal. But she could give me hints. Tell me when certain types of meetings were scheduled. Mention in passing when important documents were being prepared. Through her, I learned that my father was indeed rewriting his will. And, as I suspected, I wasn't in it. But she also told me something else. There were irregularities. Documents that didn't quite match. Signatures that seemed off. My father, in his determination to erase me completely, had made mistakes. And I began to understand that those mistakes could be my opportunity. I started building my case. I gathered every piece of documentation I could find, old family photos that still showed me, school records, medical records, anything that proved I was his daughter and had been deliberately excluded. I documented every attempt he'd made to erase me from family history. I found witnesses, teachers, neighbors, family friends, who remembered me and were willing to testify about what they'd seen. But the most important piece came from an unexpected source, my grandmother. My father's mother had never approved of how he treated me. She was old-fashioned, believed in family loyalty and fairness. Before she died, 2 years before my father's heart problems began, she'd done something remarkable. She'd made me her medical power of attorney, and she'd convinced my father to do the same. It was a formality, she'd told him. Someone needed to make medical decisions if he was incapacitated, and Marcus was too irresponsible. She'd suggested a professional medical advocate, but then casually mentioned that I had training in medical ethics as part of my graduate work. My father, in one of his rare moments of pragmatism, had signed the documents. He probably didn't even remember doing it. Comment: she planned this if you're starting to see the full picture. The revenge is calculated. But I remembered. And I kept those documents safe, locked away, waiting for the moment when they might matter. That moment came at the will reading. When Henderson read my father's will and declared that I would receive nothing, I wasn't surprised. I'd expected it. What I hadn't expected was the additional clause my father had included, a specific stipulation that stated I was to be excluded from all family trusts, all business considerations, all future estate matters. He wanted to ensure that even after his death, I would remain erased. That's when I spoke up. He hasn't seen it yet, has he? I said, and the room went silent. Henderson looked confused. Seen what? He asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. The medical power of attorney documents, signed by my father 8 years ago, giving me sole authority to make medical and financial decisions in the event of his incapacity. Henderson's face went white. That would have been superseded by what? I interrupted, my voice still calm. By a will? Medical power of attorney doesn't get superseded by a will, Mr. Henderson. It's a separate legal instrument. And according to the neurological reports from his last 3 medical examinations, I placed another document on the table. My father was diagnosed with early-stage dementia 18 months ago, which means any legal document signed after that diagnosis could be challenged as being made while he was not of sound mind. The room erupted. Marcus jumped to his feet, shouting. Henderson started frantically flipping through papers. But I just sat there, calm, waiting. Because I had more. Over the next 20 minutes, I laid it all out. The medical power of attorney that my father had forgotten about. The diagnosis that called into question his competency during the time he'd rewritten his will. The evidence of his systematic erasure of me from family records, which demonstrated a pattern of behavior that could be argued as irrational and vindictive. And then the final piece, the addendum. Drop addendum if you want to know what she found. This is where everything changes. Buried in my father's papers, discovered by my private investigator, was a document my father had written but never officially filed. It was dated 15 years ago during a brief period when my mother had convinced him to go to family therapy. In it, he'd outlined a different distribution of his estate, one that included me. He'd never filed it, never made it official, but it existed. And it showed that at one point, he'd intended to treat his children fairly. Combined with the dementia diagnosis and the evidence of his erratic behavior, I had enough to challenge the will. Enough to force a settlement. Enough to ensure that I wouldn't be erased. But I wasn't interested in just money. I wanted something else. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus will get the beach house, and the investment portfolio. I don't want them. But the family business, the one my father built, the one he valued above everything else, that's going to be split. 50-50, as it should have been from the start. Marcus looked like he might have a stroke. You can't. I can, I said. And I will. Unless you want me to take all of this to court, where we can have a very public discussion about father's business practices, his treatment of his daughter, and his mental state in his final years. Or you can agree to the split, and we can all move on with our lives. Henderson was sweating. Marcus was shaking with rage. And I was finally, after all these years, in control. The next hour was a blur of negotiations. Henderson tried to find loopholes, but I've been preparing for this moment for years. Every argument he raised, I had a counter. Every legal precedent he cited, I had a case that contradicted it. Finally, exhausted and defeated, Marcus agreed. We would split the business. He would get slightly more of the liquid assets, but I would have an equal say in the company that bore our family name. Comment justice served if you think she did the right thing, but is this justice or revenge? As everyone signed the revised documents, Henderson looked at me with something that might have been respect. You planned this, he said quietly. For years. I confirmed. Every step. Every document. Every piece of evidence. My father tried to erase me, but he forgot one important thing. The people you erase don't disappear. They just become invisible while they prepare. Marcus left without speaking to me. He hasn't spoken to me since. The business is now under joint control, and from what I hear, he's furious every day that he has to see my name on the letterhead. But here's the thing. I don't enjoy his suffering. I don't revel in the revenge. What I wanted was never about hurting anyone. It was about existing, about being seen, about refusing to be erased from a history that I was part of, whether my father liked it or not. In the weeks after the will reading, I went through my father's personal effects. There were boxes of documents, photos, mementos from a life lived in pursuit of success at any cost. And buried at the bottom of one box, I found something that made me cry for the first time since his death. It was a photo of me as a child, maybe 4 years old, sitting on my father's shoulders. We were both laughing. He was looking up at me with something in his eyes that could only be described as love. On the back, in his handwriting, my brilliant girl. So much like her mother. So much fire. He had loved me once. I don't know when that changed or why. Maybe it was the divorce. Maybe it was something about me that reminded him too much of my mother, of a marriage that had failed, of vulnerabilities he couldn't afford to acknowledge. Maybe it was the business dealings I'd witnessed, the parts of himself he was ashamed of. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he was just a man who didn't know how to love something he couldn't control. I'll never know the answer. And I've made peace with that. Type closure if you believe some wounds never fully heal. There's still more to this story. 6 months after the will reading, I did something that would have infuriated my father. I used my position in the family business to launch an ethics review. We examined every contract, every partnership, every deal that had been made over the past 20 years. What we found wasn't criminal, but it wasn't right either. Exploitative labor practices in overseas factories. Environmental shortcuts that met legal requirements but violated the spirit of environmental protection. Partnerships with companies that had dubious human rights records. I brought it all to light. Not publicly. That would have destroyed the business and hurt innocent employees. But internally, we made changes. We pulled out of questionable partnerships. We improved labor conditions. We implemented environmental standards that went beyond legal requirements. Marcus fought me on every single decision. He said I was destroying our father's legacy. But that's exactly what I was doing. I was dismantling the parts of that legacy that deserved to be destroyed and building something better in its place. The business took a hit financially in the short term, but long term, it became stronger. Employees were more loyal. Customers trusted us more. Investors who cared about ethical practices started paying attention. We became the company my father could have built if he'd cared about more than just profit and control. And slowly, painfully, I began to build a relationship with Marcus. Not a warm one. Too much damage had been done for that. But a functional one. He stopped seeing me as the enemy and started seeing me as a business partner. We'd never be close, but we could be professional. Civil, that was enough. A year after the will reading, I received a letter from one of my father's old business associates. He'd heard about the changes I was making to the company, and he wanted to tell me something. He said that in my father's final years, before the dementia took hold, he talked about me occasionally. Not often and never directly, but in passing moments. He was proud of you, the letter said. He'd read articles about your academic achievements. He knew you'd made something of yourself without his help. I think that scared him. You were proof that he wasn't necessary. And for a man who needed, to be central to everything, that was unbearable. Comment complicated. If you understand that parents can be both victims and villains, this isn't simple. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't heal the wounds or erase the years of pain. But it helped me understand. My father had erased me not because I was worthless, but because I had worth that didn't come from him. I was a reminder of his own failures, his own insecurities, his own inability to love without strings attached. And so he'd chosen to pretend I didn't exist rather than confront what my existence meant about him. I think about that conference room often. The moment when I smiled and said, "He hasn't seen it yet." The moment when everything shifted, when the erased became visible, when the forgotten became undeniable. But more than that, I think about what came after. Because revenge, if that's what you want to call it, is hollow. The real victory wasn't in taking half the business or forcing Marcus to acknowledge me. The real victory was in surviving. In building a life despite everything. In refusing to internalize my father's rejection and let it define me. I have a family now, a husband who sees me, children who will never know what it's like to be invisible in their own home. I run half of a multimillion-dollar company and use that platform to make ethical changes my father would have despised. I exist loudly, proudly, undeniably. My father tried to erase me from his will, from family history, from the narrative of his legacy. But he couldn't erase me from reality. I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes people ask me if I forgive him. It's a complicated question. I don't carry active hatred. That takes too much energy, and I have better things to do. But I don't forgive him either. Forgiveness implies reconciliation, implies that the relationship could have been repaired. We never had that chance. He died believing he'd successfully erased me. He never knew about the documents I'd gathered, the case I'd built, the reckoning that was coming. In a way, I suppose that's its own kind of mercy. Drop survivor. If you know someone who's been written out of a family, this story is for them. What I've learned from all of this is that families are complicated ecosystems where love and dysfunction intertwine in ways that can't be easily untangled. My father loved Marcus, genuinely, I think, but even that love was possessive and controlling. He loved the idea of a perfect son more than he loved the actual person Marcus was. And Marcus has suffered for it, in his own way. He's spent his entire life trying to be worthy of an approval that could never be earned because it was always conditional, always based on performance rather than inherent worth. In trying to be the favorite, Marcus became trapped in a role that didn't allow for failure, vulnerability, or authentic self-expression. I was erased, but Marcus was suffocated. Neither of us came out unscathed. The difference is that I was forced to build an identity outside my father's shadow. I had to become someone independent of his approval or rejection. Marcus never had that opportunity. He's still trying to live up to a ghost, still trying to be worthy of a love that died with our father. Sometimes, I think I was the lucky one. There are moments when I drive past my father's grave. He's buried in an exclusive cemetery where wealth buys you eternal real estate, and I wonder what I'd say to him if I could. Would I yell? Cry? Demand answers? Would I show him what I've built, prove that I didn't need him? Or would I simply tell him about his grandchildren, the ones he never knew, and hope that somewhere in whatever comes after, he feels regret for all he missed? I don't stop at the grave. I just drive past, acknowledge its existence, and keep moving. Because that's what survival looks like. Not forgetting, not forgiving, but not being defined by the wound either. The will reading was 2 years ago now. The business is thriving under the ethical restructuring. Marcus and I have found a working rhythm, if not a personal one. My mother remarried and is happier than I've ever seen her. Life goes on, as it always does, moving forward whether we're ready or not. Comment moving forward if you believe healing is a journey, not a destination. We're almost at the end. But I still think about that moment in the conference room. The way Henderson's hands shook when I pulled out those documents. The way Marcus's face went from smug to shocked in seconds. The way I felt, not triumphant, but finally seen. He hasn't seen it yet. Those words meant so many things. He hadn't seen the documents. He hadn't seen my preparation. He hadn't seen that erasing someone from paper doesn't erase them from reality. He hadn't seen that the daughter he dismissed would become the architect of his legacy's transformation. He hadn't seen me. Not really. Not ever. But that was his blindness, not my invisibility. I was always here. I was always real. And now everyone knows it. So when people ask me what I learned from all this, here's what I tell them. You cannot erase people, no matter how hard you try. You cannot write someone out of history when they refuse to be forgotten. You cannot build a legacy on cruelty and expect it to stand forever. Eventually, the truth surfaces. Eventually, the erased become visible. Eventually, the silent speak. And sometimes, just sometimes, they have the last word. My father died thinking he'd won, thinking he'd successfully removed me from his story. He hadn't seen it yet. The reckoning, the revelation, the resurrection of the daughter he tried to bury. But in the end, he didn't need to see it. Because it wasn't about him seeing me. It was about me refusing to be invisible. It was about me fighting back not with noise but with preparation, with patience, with the kind of strategic thinking he'd ironically taught me through his own ruthless business practices. He wanted to erase me. Instead, he taught me how to be unerasable. Final call. Comment justice or revenge. With your honest answer, I want to know what you really think. And subscribe if you want more stories about families, secrets, and the price of being forgotten. Next week's story is about a mother who discovered her daughter's hidden inheritance and what she did when she learned where it came from. You won't want to miss it. The sun was setting as I left Henderson's office that day 2 years ago, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful for the darkness we'd just navigated. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and for a long moment I didn't move. Then I called my husband and said simply, "It's done. I'm coming home." And that's the real ending to this story. Not the will reading, not the revenge, not the business transformation. The ending is that I had a home to go to. I had people who loved me not for what I could provide or how well I performed, but simply because I existed. I had a life that my father's rejection couldn't touch because I'd built it beyond his reach. He tried to erase me from his will, but he couldn't erase me from the world. I'm still here, And I always will be.